Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more of Warhammer 40k lore. Since just last week we talked about how Space Marines on occasion fall to chaos, or even indeed how they sometimes don't actually fall to the Dark Gods, but simply go renegade, whether they were manipulated into doing so, or because they got greedy, or because they simply disagreed with the actions of the Imperium. But are there any examples of the opposite? Have Chaos Space Marines ever returned to the light of the God Emperor before? Have renegade chapters ever become loyalist chapters again? That is an interesting little question, as there are actually a couple examples, both of fully fledged Chaos Space Marines and those who have merely been misled, and even those who have been declared renegade, but who don't really agree with the classification. Though, make no mistake, it is significantly rarer for somebody to become a loyalist again than it is to fall to chaos. Now, obviously, the most immediate example of somebody remaining loyal despite other members of one's immediate chapter, or in this case, Legion, going heretical is, of course, the Space Marine Legions. As in many cases, significant numbers of the Legionnaires were simply not ready to turn their backs on the Imperium and the Emperor. This was, of course, what led to the Great Purge at Istvan, where many of the traitor Primarchs got rid of the elements of their legions that they simply did not believe would follow them into open rebellion. But these, of course, don't quite fulfill our criteria here of Space Marines who have returned to the light of the Emperor. As they didn't know they were getting betrayed, it just sort of happened, and they had to deal with it, unfortunately for them. Though we do also have examples of members of the traitor legions who, upon being informed that their legion had been turned traitor, and upon receiving instructions to also turn traitor by their Primarch's envoys, refused to do so. With the most famous example, of course, being the warsmith Dantiok, who told Petarabo's envoy to get fucked. But, again, this is somewhat different from what we are looking into here. So, one of the most comprehensive examples of a traitor chapter, quote unquote, returning to be a loyalist one, is the Soul Drinkers. The Soul Drinkers chapter have their own little book series of, I believe, 3 books, if memory serves. They're not the finest pieces of 40k literature ever made, but I did think they were quite good for what they were, and they gave a rather unique perspective on what it is like to be a, in many ways, outright tainted chapter, but that was still unwilling to actually abandon the God Emperor. To give you a quick little rundown of what happened here without too much in the way of spoilers, in case you feel like reading this book series for yourself, the Soul Drinkers chapter, a group of them, came into a little bit of a sticky situation whilst attacking a, well, demon hold, in essence. The Soul Drinkers' force was about to get its ass destroyed by a whole host of chaos-infested weaponry and demonic creatures. But just as they were about to be overwhelmed, they received a vision of seemingly the God Emperor coming to grant them strength in their hour of greatest need, granting them special abilities, incredible powers, remarkable weapons, and even physical blessings, warping their forms, like, for example, giving one warrior with a penchant for close quarters combat an enormous, muscled, and scaled right arm with unbelievable unholy strength. Yeah, one is already beginning to see a couple of small problems with all of this, but it's easy to understand how a bunch of ferociously loyal Space Marines would see this apparent blessing and view it as just that, a blessing. They even returned to the chapter, and when the rest of their brothers saw them, they declared them traitors immediately and tried to kill them. But the Soul Drinkers overcame some challenges, including a duel to the death between the old chapter master and the changed librarian, who had led his brothers into believing that this was all a gift from the Emperor, and so on. And the chapter then embarked, now unified under their librarian's leadership, to strike out against the enemies of the Emperor. And to be fair, they were attacking Chaos Heretics, so it all seemed to check out, but it turned out to just be a greater demon of Tzeentch fucking with them in order to deal with his competition. Once they learned this, the Soul Drinkers were, of course, dismayed, absolutely horrified. They'd become straight-up Chaos Space Marines, doing the biddings of a literal demon. This was their greatest fear, but they overcame this demonic creature, and instead of killing themselves, which was very much so an option that they discussed, they decided instead to try and redeem themselves in the eyes of the Emperor and in the eyes of their Primarch, which they considered very important. They thought themselves to be an Imperial Fist founding chapter, which, well, again, let's not go too far into that. A successor chapter, by the way, excuse me. And they did indeed carry out many valuable actions against the enemies of the Imperium, even saving the Howling Griffins and getting them out of a rather sticky situation of their own. Eventually, the Soul Drinkers were, however, hunted down, and attempts were made to bring them to justice at a Conclave of Dawn. The Soul Drinkers, however, again proved that they were no pawns of chaos through their repeated actions of heroism against chaos. And, well, for all intents and purposes, they appeared to be genuine loyalists. This, then, is an example of a chapter who didn't really, truly fall, but clung still to their duty to the Emperor, even in the face of straight-up chaos corruption. But this is kind of the easy way out, right? After all, they were never truly Chaos Marines. They just, cosplayed as them for a while and bore some of their more striking physical features, so okay, sort of, but not entirely. We do have an example, actually, of a actual, literal, corrupted Chaos Space Marine turning loyalist as well. A Plague Marine, of all things, which, damn, I mean, a Plague Marine. How do you come back from that? As that is not merely a mental corruption, although it is very much so a mental corruption as well, but also one of the body and the soul. As one of the intriguing side effects, I suppose, of Nurgle cursing someone is that Nurgle's rot is not merely a rot of the physical form. It's certainly that as well, but it is a psychological rot. In the Liber Chaotica, for example, there are described efforts of a priest of Shalia to cure the Nurgle's rot, but all of their usual spells, which would cure bacterial infection, viruses, etc., simply don't work. And the priestess points out that the Nurgle's rot appears to be as much a symptom of the mind, of hopelessness and despair, as it is a physical ailment. So, if you thought the Soul Drinkers were a little bit easy mode, this surely would be extreme hard mode. The example I'm speaking of here is a Ultramarines sergeant by the name of Castus. He was corrupted via mental measures, spells in essence, to fall prey to the vagaries of Nurgle preying upon his mind. He, you could argue, wasn't entirely in command of his faculties, sort of like when the Soul Drinkers were tricked. But he became a willing and eager pawn of Nurgle, worshipping the god of decay and waging war eagerly and happily in his name for decades. But Castus had his faith tainted by magics, wiping his memories. So, when these memories were eventually restored to him, he became a loyalist yet again, despite the horrible curse placed upon his body. He chose to sacrifice himself, knowing that there would be no returning from this. He might have an opportunity to redeem himself and wipe clean many of his horrific actions, but there was no rejoining the Ultramarine ranks, looking the way he did, and after everything he had done. And so he went back to the person who had enthralled him with a planet cracker warhead stuck in his abdomen. Which is one hell of a way to take revenge. I gotta admit, there's some serious style points there, no doubt about it. So, that is an example of a Space Marine, fully corrupted, that chose to become loyal. Redeemed, perhaps not, but loyal once more. We also have other examples of similar things, although we are going to veer slightly from our original topic here of Space Marines into the Sisters of Battle. Now, the Sisters have often been proclaimed as the purest of the God Emperor's servants, and that not a one has ever fallen to chaos. This is sort of true. Not entirely, but pretty damn close, as there have been a couple of sisters that have, in essence, fallen, but more forcibly rather than by choice, becoming a demon host, for example. But the example I'm thinking of was actually an entire Adeptus Sororitas cloister, a chapter in essence, but often larger, all turning traitor at the same time, in a move that absolutely shocked the Imperium. I mean, it's one thing for a rare and insanely ridiculous exception to happen, but for an entire convent to turn against the Emperor, and then attack the Emperor's servants immediately thereafter. Okay, something very weird is going on here, and indeed something very weird was going on there, as they had not actually turned against the Emperor by choice, or even this time via chaos corruption. They had been mind-controlled by an unfathomably powerful Psyker, who had the power to place seemingly any number of people under his permanent command, with, again, no seemingly upper limit, the moment they heard his voice. So, one word from his lips, and you would be his servant forever. Even after his death, in fact. Okay, I think we can give the sisters a bit of a pass on this one then. These two sisters were liberated by Cythus Cain, or more correctly, by Jurgen, during the climax of... was it Last Stand? I can't remember. I think it was Last Stand. Took place on top of a dam, I believe, where the Psyche was flanked by a pair of Sororita's guards, which she used as honor guards and, let's be honest, probably flashlights. And once Jurgen, famously a blank, got close, that cancelled out the psychic bond that the Psyche had over them. One of the sisters was already dead by then after a lively exchange of fire. The other chose to eat her own bolt gun immediately after the unimaginable horrors that she had been exposed to. So, again, an example of sort of redemption, but sort of. As I'm sure you were able to tell by now, yes, the tales of genuine, actual returning to the light are pretty damn rare. And more often than not, the best thing you can hope for are renegade chapters that simply don't choose to turn entirely to chaos. The Ashen Claws are one such example. The Ashen Claws used to be a part of the Raven Guard's Legion, but they didn't fit in very well, to put it mildly. And after the legions were broken up due to Gilliman's decree at the end of the Horus Heresy, the Ashen Claws were sent off to the edges of the Ghoul Stars, largely to get them the heck out of the way, as nobody seemed to really have liked them very much. And the feeling was very much so mutual, as the Ashen Claws decided that if the Imperium didn't want them, if their legion didn't want them, then why should they want the Imperium? They therefore turned renegade, piratical raiders, though of a rather interesting little flavor, as the Ashen Claws maintained in many ways the belief of the old Imperium, the Imperial truth, and the idea that Space Marines should be there to bring peace of sorts to the galaxy, although their beliefs had been quite severely twisted from their original, once noble intents. The Ashen Claws viewed themselves as superior to baseline humanity, that they should not be expected to serve that humanity, but rather rule over it. And even if not quite so stridently put, at the very least that they were worth a hell of a lot more than the average Imperial citizen, especially the average Imperial citizen of an Imperium that they no longer recognized as the Imperium they once served. Thus, they of course did not throw their lot in with chaos. Indeed, they fought against chaos as viciously as anything else, having originally resisted Horus's great heresy, of course, even having fought significant actions against the traitors back during the Siege of Terra and other such actions. But they were no friends of the modern-day Imperium either, and would more than happily raid its shipping lanes, its supplies, and its people for anything and everything that they required to survive. In essence, they became not traitors, not renegades necessarily, as they did this for a reason other than simply just enriching themselves, but they certainly weren't loyal to the current Imperium either. In one way, I suppose, you could argue that this made them the most loyal of all loyalists, as most of the other modern-day chapters have deviated quite significantly from what was once their original doctrine. Indeed, if you will allow me a brief side tangent here as well, one of the intriguing things that has become normal now is the idea that the Space Marines worship the God Emperor. Back in the day, the Space Marine Codex explained that they, of course, viewed the Emperor as a great man, the first amongst equals, the foremost of all of humanity, but he was nevertheless a man. They revered him, they honored him, and they served him, of course, but he was, at the end of the day, another human, another man. Now, there have been those chapters, of course, that have always declared him to be a god. The Black Templars leap to mind as an immediate example of that. But it was not something that all chapters did automatically and guaranteed. That is a more recent lore addition. So, again, you could argue that the Ashen Claws simply continued the traditions of the old legions, remaining loyal not to the Imperium of the God Emperor, but the original Imperium that came before it. Still, we haven't really gotten into that many forces, if any at all, that have actually redeemed themselves, have we? Well, again, to be honest, there just aren't that many examples of it, but we do have one, at least, to end on a bright spot, a more optimistic note, and that is the Knights of Blood. The Knights of Blood were a later addition to the roster of Blood Angel's successor chapters, and it was not a lucky one as far as the hereditary problems of the Blood Angels were concerned. Even from the earliest reports, it was made clear that the Knights of Blood suffered quite heavily from the Red Thirst, and in effect then of the Black Rage too. Not great. And they did go on to do some pretty heavy-duty shit across the Imperium. Unable to control themselves, they were found guilty of countless incredibly violent atrocities, and did not grow particularly popular amongst their Imperial allies, who viewed them in many cases as an outright liability. One as likely to inflict significant damage upon their allies as their enemies. But they still weren't traitors or anything. They were attacking the enemies of man. They came to the aid of Imperial worlds. It's just that, they weren't necessarily all that discriminatory in where they aimed their orbital bombardments. Which, hey, you know me, I am happy to defend the Marines' malevolence, so that in and of itself is certainly not automatically a negative thing as far as I'm concerned, but the rest of the Imperium does tend to disagree. It was this disagreement and a very, very long and deep trail of bodies that eventually made the Inquisition take notice of the Knights of Blood. Now, the Inquisition, of course, it's literally their job to look into the Astartes whenever they get a little bit overzealous in the execution of their mandate. Now, the Inquisition does tend to err on the side of caution with such things, as a Space Marine chapter usually has to do something pretty goddamn outrageous for the Inquisition to outright condemn them. In the case of the Knights of Blood, not only had they done something pretty outrageous, they had done it on multiple occasions, and seemed determined to continue to do it on multiple occasions thereafter, so they were eventually declared excommunicatis traitoris. In an unusually Chad move, however, the Knights of Blood sort of refused to acknowledge that. Which sounds funny when you say it, but that is pretty much exactly what they did. They decided that, okay, so they've been declared traitors, so what? Do they care? Not overmuch, apparently. They'd simply continue going about their business, aiding the Imperium to the best of their abilities, regardless of what the Inquisition had to say about it. And the Knights of Blood pretty much just continued doing whatever they wanted to do. They would continue to intervene in various local wars fought across the Imperium. They would arrive, butcher the enemies of the God Emperor, and then disappear before anybody with enough authority to bother them showed up. The Imperium also made at best a half-hearted effort, really, to try to apprehend them, as at the end of the day, despite the fact that they weren't particularly popular, they weren't doing any more damage than the invaders were doing, and they were genuinely aiding and saving a fair few planets, worlds, and cities as well. Sure, they didn't have an official blessing to do so, or orders, technically, but Astartes chapters have always operated largely independent of central governance, so this didn't really change all that much. The only slight bother was that wherever the Knights of Blood showed up, the Inquisition would occasionally follow as well, to try to figure out whether or not the Knights had shown up for no particular reason, or if there were some sort of collaboration going on, if they had been called to that region by somebody. In essence, the Inquisition would show up, make a nuisance out of themselves as they wander around the countryside, asking stupid questions as to whether anyone nearby had the ability to call in a chapter of Space Marines. And then they would fuck off again, and all due likelihood, none the wiser. Still, the Inquisition knocking about is always a bother for everyone involved, so that did make the Knights a little bit more unwelcome than they might otherwise have been. There is also some indication that the Knights of Blood suffered internal disagreements about exactly what the chapter was to do now. They appeared to have remained largely of similar intent when it came to continuing to be loyalists, but the chapter operated on a surprisingly large basis, scouring the galaxy and seemingly not going around their usual haunts. Now, chapters tend to operate in specific regions because, well, they become well known there. They develop connections with the local power structures, and also building upon recruitment centers. Obviously, considering the fact that they were excommunicated traitors, they couldn't very well maintain a recruiting world. And anyone that they had extended communications with, the aforementioned problems with the Inquisition would complicate that somewhat. So they probably roamed the galaxy, picking up recruits wherever they could, from hive worlds or feral planets or whatever else they came across that seemed like fertile hunting grounds. They probably also set up some backwater outposts here and there to look for worthwhile recruits. But they seem to have scattered into smaller formations, as the Knights of Blood were used as an enemy to show how powerful Commander Shadowsong was in one of the Tau Codexes, I believe, and that's quite the distance away from where the Knights of Blood story ended, and where they finally got their redemption. Although I suppose they would probably argue they didn't really need any redemption. See, during the events of the Battle for Baal, when the Tyranids invaded en masse and was about to wipe out the Blood Angels chapter, several of their successor chapters came to their aid. And one of those chapters was the Knights of Blood. They dumped themselves straight into the heart of the encroaching Tyranid horde on one of Baal's moons, allowing several other successor chapters to effectively disengage themselves from the Tyranid main force and make a retreat down to Baal proper, where they would carry out their own apparently last stand, until being saved by the MacGuffin that was a resurrected Gilliman and literal legions of new Space Marines. The Knights of Blood, therefore, were allowed an opportunity to save the Blood Angels in its entirety. Not just the chapter, not just the successor chapters, but Baal, the chapter's gene seed stores, and its holiest of holdings. A fine exit for such a troublesome little chapter that probably would not have an easy place in the Imperium to come, as somehow I doubt that the Primaris reinforcements arriving with Rowboat Girlyman would include Knights of Blood reinforcements. A good send-off, and this, I would argue, is the closest we've come to a renegade/traitor chapter receiving their genuine return to form, loyalty, perhaps, in the eyes of the Imperium, as whilst I do not believe the condemnation of excommunicatis traitoris was ever technically lifted, the Knights of Blood are now remembered as an honourable chapter who sacrificed themselves for the Imperium's greatest warriors and the continuation of the Blood Angels. A more than honourable and worthy legacy. Although, again, admittedly, one could certainly argue that the Knights of Blood never really actually, fell to chaos, but, well, as I mentioned already, there aren't a whole lot of cases of anyone coming back from chaos corruption, because it isn't merely a choice of sides. It isn't usually even just a doctrinal disagreement. It is usually a corruption of the very spirit. It is a fundamental change of the person in question, of the Space Marine, of their values, of their moralities, of their very ways of viewing the world. And even if they, for some reason, could randomly decide to throw all of that off and change their mind again, and again, it's more than merely changing their minds. It's more like being, well, first corrupted by magic, and then being thoroughly indoctrinated in its values for God only knows how many decades, if not centuries, if not millennia, whilst being suffused with a power that corrupts on a base and unavoidable level. But even if one could simply one day wake up and go, wow, killing all of those civilians was really not very chill of me at all, the Imperium isn't going to accept you back. Even if they wanted to, even if you carried out great deeds to redeem yourself, you are still corrupted. You've still been a tool of chaos, and there is no guarantee that you could not spread that corruption to others, no matter how noble your intentions were. See, this is what made Fulgrim's original imprisonment within the portrait so interesting. Before the whole reflection cracked storyline. Because having Fulgrim be still a pure spirit, not fully corrupted by the demon from the lair sword, but trapped and held in stasis within a picture, means that when he did return after being discovered by some salvagers or whatever plot point you'd like to use, he would still, theoretically, be pure, but would nevertheless have a pretty hard time working his way into the graces of the Imperium, as him showing up on Terra and going, hey there, hello, remember me? Maybe you don't actually, you might have wiped me off all Imperial records, but I'm the Primarch of the Emperor's Children. Yeah, those, the pink ones with the noise marines that rape people to death. Yeah, It's a long story, but I'm not with those anymore. I promise. Please let me prove it. It could genuinely be rather intriguing. And there could even be a long and interesting redemption arc where, even if he is not officially recognized as a redeemed Primarch, perhaps he could, in essence, become some sort of shadowy Dark Avenger. Some sort of almost Legion of the Damned-esque entity, mayhaps. And I mean, even if he simply spent eternity wandering the Imperium, attempting to somehow make up for all of the damage that his momentary lapse in mental fortitude caused when he abandoned his body to the demon in the sword, well, it wouldn't be a worse story than what they gave to Vulcan in the Beast series, so, you know, take what you can, I do suppose. Until next time, however, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.